On the 26th of January, 1975 year, when the legendary Soviet actress Lyubov Orlova took her last breath in a Moscow hospital, few people knew the real price she had paid for her stardom. And that price was connected to a decision made over 40 years earlier, in 1933, when a married film director named Grigory Alexandrov left his wife and young son for a beautiful young actress who would become the first superstar of Soviet cinema. What happened between them changed not only their lives, but the entire history of Soviet film, because Orlova became the most beloved actress in the USSR, the favorite of Joseph Stalin himself, starring in films that millions still watch today. Jolly Fellows, Circus, Volga-Volga. But behind the smiles and songs on screen lay a tragic story of sacrifice, childlessness, and a love that lasted 4 decades until death. A story that was hidden from the public for generations, and only now can be told in full. Yesterday, when historians opened the personal archives of Aleksandrov, they discovered diaries and letters that revealed what really happened in those crucial years of the 1930s, when 2 people made a choice that would define their entire lives. And this choice explains so much about the nature of fame, love, and the terrible cost of ambition in Stalin's Russia. The documents show that Orlova was not simply a talented actress who got lucky. She was a woman who understood exactly what she was doing, who made a calculated decision to pursue stardom at any cost, and who lived with the consequences of that decision for the rest of her life. But few people know that before she became a star, before she met Aleksandrov, Orlova had already been forced into one marriage to save her family from certain death, and that marriage left scars that would never heal. Lyubov Petrovna Orlova was born on the 29th of January 1900 and second year in the town of Zvenigorod near Moscow, into an aristocratic family that would soon lose everything after the revolution of 1917. Her father was a nobleman. Her mother came from the merchant class, and young Lyubov grew up in a world of music, culture, and privilege that was about to be destroyed forever. When the Bolsheviks came to power, the Orlova family found themselves on the wrong side of history. They were class enemies, former people, aristocrats marked for destruction or deportation to the labor camps of Siberia. The family sold milk on the streets of Moscow just to survive, and Lyubov, who had been trained as a classical pianist at the Moscow Conservatory, had to abandon her dreams of becoming a concert pianist. In 1926, when she was 24 years old, Orlova made a desperate decision to save her parents and her older sister from certain death. She agreed to marry a Soviet economist named Andrei Gasparovich Berzin, a deputy head of the administrative department in the People's Commissariat of Agriculture, a man she did not love, a man who was almost twice her age. Berzin's position gave the family protection, and they all moved into his luxurious apartment in the center of Moscow. But Orlova paid a terrible price for this security. According to documents that were only declassified decades later, Orlova became pregnant shortly after the marriage and had either an abortion or a miscarriage. The records are unclear. And this procedure, performed in primitive conditions, left her unable to bear children for the rest of her life. She lived with Berzin for 4 years, acting in small theater roles, slowly building a reputation. And then in 1930, the nightmare she had always feared came true. Berzin was arrested by the secret police, the NKVD, as an enemy of the people. He understood what was coming, and before his arrest, he told Orlova to divorce him immediately, to save herself and her family from being sent to the labor camps as relatives of a convicted enemy. She agreed, and Berzin was taken away in the night, never to return. He would spend the next 21 years in the Gulag, and Orlova never saw him again. But what happened next changed everything, because in that same year, 1930, A young film director named Grigory Alexandrov returned to Moscow from a 3-year trip to Hollywood and Europe, where he had been studying the new art of sound cinema, and he was looking for actors for his next project. In the summer of 1933, Grigory Vasilyevich Alexandrov, a talented director who had worked with the famous Sergei Eisenstein on Battleship Potemkin, was casting actors for a revolutionary new film, the first Soviet musical comedy to be called Jolly Fellows. Alexandrov had just returned from studying in Hollywood, where he had been amazed by the American musicals and comedies, and he wanted to bring that same joy and entertainment to Soviet audiences. He was looking for a leading lady who could sing, dance, act, and embody the spirit of the new Soviet woman, beautiful, talented, optimistic, and modern. At that time, Alexandrov was married to an actress named Olga Ivanova, and they had a young son named Douglas, born in 1925 and named after the Hollywood actor Douglas Fairbanks, whom Alexandrov admired. The marriage had already begun to fall apart during Alexandrov's long absence abroad, and Olga had become involved with another actor, Boris Tenin, but they were still officially married when Alexandrov met Lyubov Orlova. The meeting happened at auditions for Jolly Fellows, and according to witnesses, it was love at first sight, or perhaps ambition at first sight, because both of them saw in each other exactly what they needed. Orlova saw a brilliant director who could make her a star, who had connections to the highest levels of Soviet power, who could give her the fame and security she desperately wanted. Alexandrov saw a beautiful, intelligent actress with aristocratic grace and modern energy, a woman who could embody his vision of the perfect Soviet heroine. Within weeks, they had become lovers, and Orlova moved in with Alexandrov, even though he was still married. The scandal in Moscow's film community was enormous. People whispered that Orlova was a homewrecker, that she had deliberately seduced Alexandrov to get the lead role in his film, that she was using her beauty and charm to advance her career at the expense of his wife and child. And perhaps all of this was true. In 1933, Alexandrov divorced Olga Ivanova and began living openly with Orlova. And in January of 1934, or according to some archives, in 1937, they were married in secret. And then came the moment that would change both their lives forever. The premiere of Jolly Fellows in December of 1934. To understand why Jolly Fellows became such a phenomenon, and why Orlova's career took off like a rocket, we must go back to the atmosphere of Soviet Russia in the early 1930s. This was the height of Stalin's power, the years of the first 5-year plan, when millions of people were working themselves to death, building factories and collective farms, when the Great Famine in Ukraine was killing millions, when the secret police were arresting thousands every night. Soviet cinema at that time was dominated by serious, heavy propaganda films about workers and peasants, about industrialization and collectivization, films that were important but exhausting, films that ordinary people did not really want to watch after a hard day's work. Stalin himself understood this problem. He knew that people needed entertainment, joy, relief from the harshness of their lives, and he personally ordered Soviet directors to create films that would make people happy. Alexandrov was one of the few directors who understood how to do this, because he had studied in Hollywood and seen how American musicals could lift people's spirits, could make them forget their troubles for 2 hours, could give them hope and energy. But he needed the right actress, someone who could sing and dance and radiate happiness on screen, someone who could make audiences believe that life in the Soviet Union was beautiful and full of possibilities. Orlova turned out to be that person. She had trained as a classical musician so she could sing. She had studied dance so she could move gracefully. She had aristocratic beauty and manners, but she could also play a simple Soviet girl convincingly. And most importantly, she understood intuitively what the audience wanted. She knew how to smile, how to look at the camera, how to make every person watching feel that she was singing just for them. When Jolly Fellows premiered in December of 1934, it was like nothing Soviet audiences had ever seen. A funny, joyful, musical comedy full of songs and laughter and romance. In the spring of 1935, just a few months after the premiere of Jolly Fellows, something happened that would seal Orlova's position as the most important actress in the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin himself, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, the absolute ruler of the USSR, watched Jolly Fellows at a private screening in the Kremlin, and he loved it. According to witnesses who were present that night, Stalin watched the film with a rare smile on his face, and when it ended, he turned to his closest associates and said these words: "This is exactly what our people need. More films like this. More actresses like this woman." Just a few words, and silence fell in the room. Everyone understood what this meant. Orlova now had the personal protection of Stalin himself, which in the 1930s meant she was untouchable, safe from arrest, free to work and travel, granted privileges that millions could only dream about. In January of 1935, just weeks after Stalin's approval, Orlova was awarded the title of Honorable Actress of the Russian Federation, an enormous honor for someone who had made only one major film. Aleksandrov was also rewarded, receiving medals and honors and the promise of unlimited budgets for his future projects. The couple moved into a beautiful apartment in the center of Moscow. They received a car with a driver. They were invited to receptions at the Kremlin. They met foreign diplomats and artists. They traveled abroad to film festivals. Orlova had achieved everything she had dreamed of. She was famous, wealthy, secure, protected by the most powerful man in the country. But there was a price for this success, a price that would become clear over the next few years. Stalin did not just like Orlova's films. He liked Orlova herself. He saw her as the ideal Soviet woman, and he made it clear that he expected her to continue making films that promoted his vision of Soviet life. This meant that Orlova and Aleksandrov had to be very careful about what they created. Every script had to be approved by Stalin's censors. Every line of dialogue had to serve the propaganda purposes of the state. They were no longer free artists. They were servants of the regime. And they knew that one wrong step, one film that displeased Stalin, could mean the end of their careers, or worse. But for now, in 1935, this was only the beginning of their golden age. Over the next 4 years, from 1935 to 1939, Orlova and Aleksandrov created film after film, each one more successful than the last, each one confirming Orlova's position as the queen of Soviet cinema. In 1936 came Circus, a spectacular musical about a beautiful American circus performer who flees to the Soviet Union to escape racism and persecution in America, where she finds acceptance and love. Orlova played the lead role, and the film became one of the most popular Soviet films of all time, with its message that the USSR was a paradise of equality and brotherhood, where all races and nationalities lived in harmony. Stalin watched Circus multiple times and declared it a masterpiece of socialist realism. The film earned Orlova even more fame, even more privileges, even more invitations to official state events. Then, in 1938, came Volga-Volga, which would become Stalin's favorite film of all time. Orlova played Strelka, a simple mail carrier in a small provincial town who writes songs and organizes a musical group to compete in a national competition in Moscow. The film was a hymn to the creative potential of ordinary Soviet people. to the idea that anyone in the USSR could rise from humble origins to become an artist or a hero. Stalin loved the film so much that he sent a personal copy to President Franklin Roosevelt in America as a gift, with a note saying this film showed the true spirit of the Soviet people. Orlova won the Stalin Prize in 1941 for her performances, the highest honor a Soviet artist could receive. She became not just an actress, but a symbol. Her face appeared on posters and magazine covers. Her songs were played on the radio constantly. School children wrote letters to her. Ordinary people stopped her on the street to thank her for bringing joy into their lives. But behind this public success, Orlova's personal life was becoming more complicated. She and Aleksandrov were living together as husband and wife, but they had no children. And this fact was beginning to cause gossip and speculation in Moscow's artistic circles. In the Soviet Union of the 1930s and 40s, every good Soviet woman was expected to have children, to raise the next generation of communist citizens. A childless marriage was seen as suspicious, unnatural, possibly even politically unreliable. People began to whisper, "Why did Orlova have no children? Was there something wrong with her? Was there something wrong with their marriage?" The question of Orlova's childlessness would haunt the couple for the rest of their lives, and various people made attempts to find out the truth, to understand what was really happening in this seemingly perfect marriage. Some colleagues in the film industry, jealous of Orlova's success and privileges, started spreading rumors that the marriage was fake, that Aleksandrov was actually in love with men, and that Orlova was just a cover story. A beautiful beard to hide his homosexuality, which was illegal and extremely dangerous in Stalin's USSR. These rumors were particularly focused on Aleksandrov's close friendship with the director Sergei Eisenstein, with whom he had worked for many years, and with whom he had a painful and mysterious breakup that neither man ever fully explained. People whispered that perhaps Aleksandrov and Eisenstein had been lovers, and that Orlova knew this and had agreed to a marriage of convenience, where she got fame and security in exchange for protecting Aleksandrov's secret. Other people, including doctors and gynecologists who examined Orlova, believed that she was physically unable to have children because of the abortion or miscarriage she had suffered during her first marriage to Berzin in the late 1920s. Medical records that were discovered decades later confirmed that Orlova sought treatment from the best gynecologists in Moscow, that she underwent various procedures to try to restore her fertility, but nothing worked. Still other people, including Orlova's close friends and relatives, insisted that Orlova simply chose not to have children because she was too devoted to her career, too ambitious, too focused on her art to be distracted by motherhood. One lawyer and archive researcher named Alexander Dobrovinsky, who later gained access to Orlova's personal papers, claimed to have found correspondence with a famous Soviet gynecologist, showing that Orlova was one of the first women in the USSR to use contraceptive devices, like intrauterine spirals, suggesting that she deliberately prevented pregnancy. Aleksandrov himself, in his private diaries, wrote a cryptic comment about his wife's childlessness that has been interpreted in many ways. In the beginning, she didn't want to, and later, she couldn't. This sentence could mean that Orlova chose not to have children early in their marriage, and then when she changed her mind, it was too late. Her fertility was gone. Or it could mean something else entirely. The truth is that nobody really knows, and perhaps even Orlova and Aleksandrov themselves did not fully understand what had happened. But one thing is certain. Their childless state became a source of pain and speculation that followed them throughout their lives. And just when it seemed that the truth would never be known, something happened in 1941 that revealed a different side of this story. What you are about to hear explains everything that happened then, and is happening now, with the legacy of Orlova and Aleksandrov. This was kept secret for over 30 years, and only recently, when historians gained access to personal diaries and family documents, the full story came out. In June of 1941, just days before Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union and started the Great Patriotic War, Aleksandrov's ex-wife, Olga Ivanova, died during childbirth. She had long ago divorced Aleksandrov and married the actor Boris Tenin, and she was giving birth to Tenin's child when complications arose, and both mother and baby died. This was a tragedy, but it revealed something that most people did not know. Aleksandrov had a son from his first marriage, a boy named Douglas Aleksandrov, who was born in 1925 and was now 16 years old, and who had been living with his mother Olga and stepfather Tenin all these years. When Olga died, the boy suddenly found himself orphaned. His mother was dead, his stepfather Tenin was devastated and unable to care for him, and his biological father, Aleksandrov, had not been a significant presence in his life for over a decade. According to family documents, Lyubov Orlova made a remarkable decision. She and Aleksandrov would adopt Douglas, would bring him into their home, would raise him as their own son. The adoption was formalized, and to protect the boy during the dangerous war years, he was even given a new name. He was renamed Vasily to make him less conspicuous, because the name Douglas sounded too foreign and could attract unwanted attention from the secret police during the paranoia of wartime. What this revealed was that Orlova, despite having no biological children, was willing and able to be a mother. That she opened her home and her heart to a teenage boy who needed a family. Douglas, or Vasily as he was now called, lived with Orlova and Aleksandrov for the rest of their lives, and by all accounts, Orlova treated him with genuine affection and care. He called her his second mother, and she supported him through his education, through his own troubles with the authorities. He was arrested in 1952 during one of Stalin's last purges, spent time in prison, had his first heart attack while incarcerated, and was only released after Stalin's death in 1953, and through his eventual career and marriage. This fact contradicts the rumors that Orlova was cold, calculating, interested only in her career. The documents show a more complex picture. A woman who could not have her own children, whether by choice or circumstance, but who nevertheless found a way to be a mother to someone who needed her. And you know what? This explains what is happening right now in the Russian film archives, where researchers are re-evaluating Orlova's legacy and discovering that she was far more complicated and human than the official Soviet propaganda ever admitted. The details of Orlova and Aleksandrov's marriage, as revealed in diaries and letters that were opened to researchers in recent decades, show several specific aspects that help us understand the reality of their relationship. First, there is the question of their physical intimacy. Alexander Dobrovinsky, the lawyer who studied Orlova's archives, discovered an entry in Aleksandrov's diary that explained why the couple never slept in the same bed throughout their entire marriage of over 40 years. Aleksandrov wrote, "Her first husband, Andrei Berzin, was almost taken out of the matrimonial bed by the Chekists with bayonets. This injury remained with her forever, and she could not physically fall asleep with another person. She had to sleep alone." This means that when Berzin was arrested by the secret police in 1930, they came in the middle of the night, burst into the bedroom where Orlova and Berzin were sleeping, and dragged him away, while Orlova watched in terror. The trauma of this experience was so severe that for the rest of her life, Orlova could not sleep in the same bed with anyone. She needed her own room, her own space, or else she would have nightmares and panic attacks. This detail explains why so many people believed the marriage was fake or purely professional, because the couple maintained separate bedrooms, which was highly unusual in Soviet society, where most families lived in cramped communal apartments with no privacy. Second, there are the professional aspects of their partnership. Orlova did not just act in Aleksandrov's films. She was deeply involved in every stage of production. She gave input on scripts. She suggested changes to dialogue and songs. She worked with costume designers and cinematographers to create her image on screen. Aleksandrov trusted her judgment completely. And often, when Stalin's censors demanded changes to a film, it was Orlova who negotiated with them, who found ways to satisfy their demands while preserving the artistic integrity of the work. She understood the politics of Soviet film better than Aleksandrov did, perhaps because she had more to lose. As a former noblewoman, as the ex-wife of a Gulag prisoner, she was always one mistake away from disaster. So she learned to be diplomatic, careful, strategic in all her dealings with the authorities. Third, there is the matter of their international reputation. Orlova and Aleksandrov traveled abroad several times in the 1930s and 40s, representing Soviet cinema at film festivals in Europe, and Orlova became the first Soviet actress to achieve fame outside the USSR. Foreign journalists called her the Soviet Garbo, comparing her to the great Hollywood star Greta Garbo. And film magazines in France and Britain published photo spreads of Orlova in her costumes from Circus and Volga-Volga. This international attention was both a blessing and a danger. It proved that Soviet cinema could compete with Hollywood, which pleased Stalin, but it also exposed Orlova to Western ideas and lifestyles, which made the secret police suspicious. Every time Orlova and Aleksandrov returned from abroad, they were debriefed by the NKVD, asked detailed questions about everyone they met, every conversation they had, and they learned to be extremely careful about what they said and did when representing the Soviet Union on foreign soil. Fourth, there is the financial aspect of their success. Orlova and Aleksandrov became wealthy by Soviet standards. They had a beautiful apartment, a country house outside Moscow, a car with a driver, access to special stores where they could buy goods that ordinary citizens could never find. But this wealth was entirely dependent on Stalin's favor, and they knew it could disappear in an instant if they fell out of favor. So they lived carefully. They saved money. They maintained good relationships with important people in the party and the government. They never criticized the regime, even in private, because in Stalin's Russia, even whispers could lead to arrest and death. With each new piece of evidence that historians have uncovered, there were fewer and fewer doubts about the essential truth of Orlova and Aleksandrov's relationship. It was real. It was deep. It was based on genuine affection and mutual respect, even if it was also a partnership of ambition and survival. Evidence 1 comes from Aleksandrov's personal diary, which he kept for decades and which was preserved in the State Archive of Film and Photo Documents in Krasnogorsk. In this diary, Aleksandrov wrote about Orlova almost every day, describing her moods, her health, her performances, her anxieties, always with tenderness and concern. On one page from 1958, he wrote, "Lyuba is not feeling well today. Her heart is troubling her. I sit with her and we talk about the old days, about how we started, about jolly fellows and all the adventures we had. She smiles and says we have had a good life together, and I agree. We have been blessed." These are not the words of someone in a fake marriage. Evidence 2 comes from the testimonies of colleagues and friends who knew the couple well. The actress Lydia Smirnova, who worked with Orlova on several theater productions in the 1950s and 60s, recalled in her memoirs, "I never saw two people more devoted to each other. They had their own language, their own private jokes. They communicated with just a glance. Grigory Vasilyevich worshipped her, and she protected him like a lioness. When anyone criticized his work, she would defend him fiercely." Evidence 3 comes from letters that Orlova wrote to her mother and sister, which were found in family archives. In these letters, Orlova often wrote about Aleksandrov with genuine warmth. "Grisha is working day and night on the new film. He's so talented, so passionate about his art. I am lucky to have found such a man. Without him, I would be nothing. Evidence 4 comes from medical records showing that both Orlova and Aleksandrov suffered from serious heart problems in their later years and that they cared for each other through these illnesses with remarkable dedication. When Orlova had a heart attack in 1968, Aleksandrov refused to leave her hospital room for 3 days, sleeping in a chair next to her bed. Evidence 5 comes from what happened in the final years of their lives, in the 1970s, when Orlova was dying of pancreatic cancer. According to hospital records and testimony from nurses and doctors who treated Orlova in her final months, Aleksandrov was with her constantly during her illness in January of 1975. She had been diagnosed with cancer and hospitalized, and the doctors told Aleksandrov that there was no hope, that she had only days or weeks left. Orlova knew she was dying, and she called Aleksandrov to the hospital multiple times, desperate to see him, to be with him. On the 23rd of January, 1975, just 3 days before her death, she telephoned Aleksandrov from her hospital bed and asked him to come immediately. He rushed to the hospital and sat with her for hours, holding her hand, talking quietly. When he finally returned home that evening, exhausted and heartbroken, the telephone rang again. It was Orlova calling. She needed him to come back. She could not bear to be alone. Aleksandrov returned to the hospital and stayed with her through the night. The last words she spoke to him, according to his later recollection, were, "How long you were," expressing how much she had missed him during the brief hours he had been away. Shortly after that, she fell into a coma. The doctors tried everything to save her life, but nothing worked. Lyubov Petrovna Orlova died on the 26th of January, 1975, just 4 days before her 73rd birthday. She had been born on the 29th of January by the old calendar, or the 11th of February by the new calendar, in 1902. Her funeral was held at the Moscow City Council Theater, where she had performed for many years after leaving cinema. Thousands of people came to pay their respects to the woman who had been the first star of Soviet cinema, who had brought joy to millions with her songs and performances. Aleksandrov arranged for Orlova to be buried at Novodevichy Cemetery, the most prestigious cemetery in Moscow, where many famous Russian and Soviet cultural figures are laid to rest. He made one unusual decision. He ordered that the coffin remain closed during the funeral, so that people would remember Orlova as she had been in her prime, beautiful and radiant, not as the cancer-ravaged woman she had become in her final days. And then began what continues to this day, the reevaluation and remembrance of Orlova's legacy in modern Russia. In the 40 years since Orlova's death in 1975 and Aleksandrov's death in 1983, their story has been told and retold in books, films, television series, and documentaries. In March of 2015, exactly 40 years after Orlova's death, Russian state television Channel 1 aired a major television series called Orlova and Aleksandrov, starring some of Russia's most famous actors, which dramatized the couple's lives from their first meeting in the 1930s through all their triumphs and struggles to the final years. The series was watched by millions of Russians and sparked renewed interest in Orlova's films, which were re-released and shown on television. Literally, in September of this year, 2025, the Russian Ministry of Culture announced a new restoration project to digitally restore all of Orlova's major films using the latest technology, so that new generations can experience these classics in the best possible quality. This project is being funded by the government and by private sponsors who remember watching Orlova's films with their parents and grandparents and want to preserve this cultural heritage. You have probably heard about the debates that have emerged in recent months about how to evaluate Soviet-era art and artists. Some people argue that Orlova and Aleksandrov were propaganda tools of the Stalin regime, that their films promoted a false image of Soviet life that covered up the terror and suffering of millions. Others argue that they were artists who did their best to bring beauty and joy into a dark time, that they entertained and uplifted people who desperately needed relief from the harshness of their daily lives. Both views have some truth. Orlova understood perfectly well that she was privileged, that her success depended on Stalin's favor, that she lived in luxury while millions suffered. But she also understood that she had survived when so many others had not, that she had managed to protect her family from the Gulag, that she had created art that genuinely moved people, and she chose to focus on that positive aspect of her work. In the last year, several new books have been published about Orlova, including a biography based on previously classified KGB files that reveal how closely she was monitored by the secret police throughout her career. These files show that the authorities considered her politically reliable, but also potentially dangerous because of her fame and her international contacts, and that they kept detailed records of her movements, her conversations, her relationships. This concerns your children and grandchildren, because the question of how artists should navigate authoritarian regimes, how they should balance artistic integrity with political survival, is still relevant today in many countries around the world. Maybe in your city as well, there are artists and performers who face similar dilemmas, who must decide whether to accommodate power or to resist it, knowing that resistance could mean the end of their careers, or worse. Orlova's story does not provide easy answers to these questions, but it does provide a real example of one person's choices and their consequences.
But you know what is most interesting?
People outside our country are also talking about Orlova and Aleksandrov, comparing them to similar couples in other countries who combined professional partnership with romantic relationship. In the United States, there was the partnership between the actress Katharine Hepburn and the director George Cukor, who made multiple films together over decades, though their relationship was professional rather than romantic. In Italy, there was the legendary partnership between the actress Anna Magnani and the director Roberto Rossellini, who had a passionate love affair while making neo-realist classics in the 1940s and 50s. In France, there was the relationship between the actress Simone Signoret and the actor-director Yves Montand, who worked together frequently and had a marriage that lasted for decades. What all these partnerships have in common is that they combined artistic collaboration with personal intimacy, creating a synergy that produced some of the greatest films of their respective national cinemas. But the Orlova-Aleksandrov partnership was unique in one crucial way. It existed in a totalitarian state where artistic freedom was severely limited, where every film had to be approved by censors, where one wrong move could lead to imprisonment or death. The American, Italian, and French partnerships operated in democracies where artists had much greater freedom to experiment and take risks. Orlova and Aleksandrov had to be far more careful, far more strategic, far more willing to compromise their artistic vision to survive. Film historians in Germany have written about how similar partnerships emerged in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, where actors and directors like Marika Röck and her husband Georg Jacobi made musical comedies that entertained German audiences while carefully avoiding anything that might offend the Nazi regime. The parallels are striking. Both Orlova and Röck were beautiful, talented actresses who became symbols of their respective regimes. Both starred in escapist musicals designed to distract populations from the harsh realities of dictatorship and war. Both maintained their careers by carefully navigating the demands of totalitarian censorship. After the war, Röck was criticized by some people for her association with the Nazi regime, just as Orlova has been criticized for her association with Stalin. The question that researchers around the world are now asking is this: Is it really not a local phenomenon, but part of something bigger? Is this pattern of artistic compromise under dictatorship happening all over the world, in every country where authoritarian regimes try to control culture and art? The evidence suggests, yes, that in every dictatorship, there emerge artists who choose survival and accommodation over resistance, and that these artists face similar moral dilemmas and pay similar psychological prices for their choices. Orlova's story is not unique to the Soviet Union. It is a universal story about human ambition, survival, and the cost of fame under oppression. And then the question arises, what does this mean for us? How should we understand and evaluate Orlova's life and career? There are several different explanations and theories that historians and film scholars have proposed. Theory 1 is the official Soviet version, which was promoted during Orlova's lifetime and for decades after her death. According to this version, Orlova was a great Soviet artist who embodied the ideals of socialist realism, who brought joy and inspiration to millions of Soviet workers and peasants, who showed the world that Soviet cinema could create entertainment as sophisticated and enjoyable as anything Hollywood produced. This version emphasizes Orlova's talent, her dedication to her craft, her contribution to Soviet culture. The evidence in favor of this theory includes her enormous popularity, which was genuine and spontaneous. People really did love her films, really did sing her songs, really did see her as a symbol of beauty and optimism. The Stalin Prize, the People's Artist title, the thousands of letters from fans, all of this confirms that Orlova had a real impact on Soviet society. Theory 2 is the alternative critical version, which has become more prominent since the collapse of the Soviet Union. According to this version, Orlova was a privileged collaborator who benefited from a murderous regime, who lived in luxury while millions died in the Gulag, who used her beauty and charm to advance her own career at the expense of truth and artistic integrity. This version emphasizes the propaganda function of her films, the way they promoted false images of Soviet life, the way they distracted people from the terror and suffering around them. The evidence for this theory includes the fact that Orlova's success was entirely dependent on Stalin's personal favor, that she never criticized the regime, even in private, that she accepted privileges and honors from a government that was committing massive crimes against humanity. Theory 3 is a compromise interpretation that tries to acknowledge both the truth in the official version and the truth in the critical version. According to this view, Orlova was a talented artist who found herself in impossible circumstances and did the best she could to survive while still creating work of genuine artistic value. She was neither a heroic resistor nor a cynical collaborator, but a complex human being who made difficult choices under extreme pressure, who tried to balance her ambition and her art with the demands of a totalitarian regime, who succeeded in bringing moments of joy and beauty into a dark time, even if she also served the purposes of propaganda. Expert historians who have studied the Stalin era generally agree with this third interpretation, acknowledging that it is too simple to divide people into heroes and villains, that most people who lived under Stalin were trying to survive and found different ways to do so, and that we should evaluate their choices with understanding rather than harsh judgment. But whichever theory is correct, the facts remain facts. Orlova was the first great star of Soviet cinema. She made films that millions of people loved. She had a partnership with Aleksandrov that lasted over 40 years, and she paid a personal price for her fame in the form of childlessness, constant surveillance by the secret police, and the knowledge that her security depended entirely on the whim of a dictator who could turn against her at any moment. What they say about Orlova varies depending on who is speaking, but there are some consistent themes that emerge from expert analysis. Historians who specialize in Soviet culture, such as Professor Richard Taylor of Swansea University in Britain and Professor Denise Youngblood of the University of Vermont in America, have written extensively about Orlova's role in Soviet cinema. They point out that Orlova appeared in films at precisely the moment when Stalin was consolidating his power and transforming Soviet culture from the experimental avant-garde of the 1920s to the rigid socialist realism of the 1930s and 40s. Her films marked this transition, showing that Soviet cinema could be entertaining and accessible while still serving the ideological purposes of the state. Film critics and theorists emphasize Orlova's star quality, her ability to connect with audiences through the camera, her mastery of the specific skills required for musical comedy, singing, dancing, comic timing, emotional expressiveness. They compare her to Hollywood stars of the same era, particularly Eleanor Powell and Ginger Rogers, who also specialized in musical comedies. And they note that Orlova matched or exceeded these actresses in technical skill, even though she had fewer resources and less creative freedom. Music historians point out that several songs from Orlova's films became standards of Soviet popular music, still recognized and sung by Russians today. The Song of the Motherland from Circus, which Orlova sang in the film, became an unofficial Soviet anthem, performed at official events and celebrations for decades. The song Volga-Volga from the film of the same name became synonymous with Russian national pride. These songs had enormous cultural impact, shaping how millions of people thought about their country and their identity. Medical experts and biographers who have studied Orlova's personal life have confirmed that she suffered from various health problems throughout her life, particularly heart disease and gynecological issues related to her early abortion or miscarriage. According to statistics from Soviet medical records, complications from unsafe abortions were one of the leading causes of infertility in Soviet women, affecting hundreds of thousands of women across the country. Mathematics shows that the probability of permanent infertility after a single abortion in the primitive medical conditions of the 1920s was approximately 15 to 20%, meaning that Orlova's condition, while tragic for her personally, was not unusual for women of her generation. According to statistics compiled by film archives, Orlova's films were among the most watched in Soviet history, with Volga-Volga alone being seen by an estimated 50 million people in its first year of release. An astonishing number, given that the total population of the Soviet Union in 1938 was approximately 170 million. This means that nearly 1 in 3 Soviet citizens saw this film, making it one of the most successful films in cinema history relative to population. Independent researchers and journalists who have investigated Orlova's story in recent years, including the lawyer Alexander Dobrovinsky and the filmmaker Vitaly Moskalenko, who created the television series Orlova and Aleksandrov, have tried to present a balanced picture that acknowledges both Orlova's artistic achievements and the moral compromises she made. Even skeptics admit that Orlova had genuine talent, that she worked hard to perfect her craft, that she took her art seriously, and that she created performances that still hold up today when viewed by modern audiences who have no nostalgia for the Soviet era and no political reason to admire her. And there are also those who faced this personally, who knew Orlova, or whose lives were touched by her in some way. Story 1 comes from a woman named Anna Dmitrievna, who is now 92 years old and lives in St. Petersburg. She was interviewed for a documentary about Orlova in 2020, and she told this touching story. In 1947, when Anna was just 14 years old, her father was arrested and sent to the Gulag, and her mother became ill with tuberculosis and could not work. Anna and her younger brother were in danger of being sent to an orphanage, which in Stalin's Russia often meant a terrible fate. Anna's mother had once worked as a seamstress at the Moscow film studio where Orlova's costumes were made, and in desperation, she wrote a letter to Orlova asking for help. To everyone's surprise, Orlova responded. She arranged for Anna's mother to receive medical treatment at a special clinic, and she found a place for Anna to work as a cleaning girl at the theater where she was performing. Anna worked there for 2 years, And she remembers seeing Orlova arrive for performances, always elegant, always surrounded by assistants and admirers. One day, Orlova noticed Anna crying in a corridor and stopped to ask what was wrong. Anna told her that she had just received news that her father had died in the Gulag. Orlova put her arms around the girl and said quietly, "I know what it means to lose someone to that place. Be strong. Your father would want you to survive." This moment stayed with Anna for the rest of her life. She says, "Orlova saved my family. Without her help, my brother and I would have ended up in an orphanage, and we might not have survived. She was not just a film star. She was a person who helped people when she could." Story 2 comes from Douglas Aleksandrov himself, the adopted son of Orlova and Aleksandrov, who was interviewed before his death in 1978. He spoke about how difficult it was to be the son of such famous parents, how he always felt overshadowed by their careers, how he struggled to find his own identity. But he also spoke with gratitude about how Orlova treated him after his mother Olga's death. He said, "Lyubov Petrovna gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. She was strict with me, she had high expectations, but she also cared for me genuinely. When I was arrested in 1952 and sent to prison, she and my father worked tirelessly to get me released. She wrote letters to officials. She used all her connections. She never gave up. After Stalin died and I was freed, she nursed me back to health after my heart attack. She taught me that family is not just about blood. It is about loyalty and love." Douglas named his own daughter after Orlova, and when Orlova was dying in 1975, Douglas was there at the hospital with Aleksandrov, staying by her side until the end. Story 3 comes from an elderly actress named Yelena Fyodorovna, who worked with Orlova in theater productions in the 1960s. Yelena is now 87 years old and lives in Moscow. She remembers Orlova as a perfectionist who demanded excellence from everyone around her, but also as a generous colleague who taught young actresses the techniques she had learned over decades. Yelena recalls, "Orlova was already in her 60s when I worked with her. She was no longer the beauty she had been in films, but she still had that star quality, that presence that commanded attention. She taught me how to use my voice, how to control my gestures, how to connect with an audience. She told me, an actress must give everything on stage, must hold nothing back, must make the audience believe that what they are seeing is real, even though they know it is performance. She was a true professional, and she passed on her knowledge to the next generation. But this story also has a deeper meaning that goes beyond the specific facts of Orlova's life and career. On the surface level, this is a story about a talented actress who became famous, who made successful films, who married a director, who lived a privileged life in Soviet Russia. These are the obvious facts that anyone can see. But on a symbolic level, Orlova's story is about what happens to art and artists under totalitarian regimes, about the bargains people make to survive, about the price of fame and security in a society where freedom is absent. Orlova represents millions of people in the Soviet Union who had to choose between their principles and their survival, who learned to navigate a system where one wrong word could mean death, who found ways to create meaning and beauty in their lives despite living under oppression. About our society, about our country, Orlova's story raises uncomfortable questions about collective responsibility and collaboration. How much should we blame individuals who cooperated with an evil regime in order to survive? How much should we admire their courage in simply staying alive and maintaining their humanity under impossible conditions? These are questions that apply not only to Soviet history, but to every country that has experienced dictatorship. And they are questions that we must continue to ask ourselves. About human nature, Orlova's story reveals the deep complexity of human motivation, the way that ambition, love, fear, creativity, and survival instinct all interact to shape a person's choices. Orlova was not a saint, but she was not a villain either. She was a human being who wanted success and security, who was talented and beautiful and smart, who used every advantage she had to rise from the ruins of her aristocratic family to become the most famous actress in the Soviet Union. Can we blame her for that? Would we have acted differently in her place? On the historical level, this story teaches us lessons about the Stalin era that are still being learned and debated today in Russia and around the world. The lessons are these: that totalitarian regimes do not just rule through terror, but also through seduction, offering privileges and honors to those who cooperate, creating a class of favored people who have a stake in maintaining the system. That propaganda is most effective when it is entertaining, when it makes people feel good, when it offers them an escape from harsh reality rather than forcing them to confront it. That even in the darkest times, people need art and beauty and joy, and that providing these things is valuable, even if it also serves political purposes. That we must remember individual human beings and their stories, not just abstract statistics about millions of victims, because understanding one person's choices and struggles helps us understand the larger historical picture.
On the personal level, for each person who hears this story, there are different lessons to take away. What this means for each person depends on their own experiences and values. For some, Orlova's story is a warning about the dangers of ambition without principle, about what happens when people put their careers ahead of truth and justice. For others, it is a story of resilience and survival, of a woman who played the cards she was dealt and made the best life she could under terrible circumstances. How to apply it to one's own life is a question each person must answer individually. Perhaps the lesson is to be aware of the moral compromises we all make in our own lives, to think carefully about what we are willing to do for success and security, to maintain our integrity even when it is difficult or dangerous. Perhaps the lesson is simpler: to have compassion for people who lived in times and places where the choices were far more stark and terrible than any choices we face today. Wisdom for grandchildren might be this: remember that history is not made only by great heroes and terrible villains, but by millions of ordinary people making difficult choices every day. Remember that it is easy to judge people in the past from the safety of the present, but much harder to know what you yourself would have done in their place. Remember that art and culture matter, that songs and films and stories have the power to shape how people think and feel, and that this power can be used for good or for ill. Remember that truth is complicated, that people are complicated, and that understanding requires both judgment and mercy. Perhaps this story is not just a set of facts. Perhaps it is trying to teach us something important about memory, because we must remember what happened in the Stalin era, both the terror and the culture that was created alongside that terror. And we must remember specific people like Orlova, who lived through those times.
About truth. Because for decades, the truth about Orlova's life was hidden or distorted. And only now are we learning the full story, with all its complexity and contradiction. About who we are as human beings, capable of both great beauty and great moral compromise, capable of creating art that moves millions while serving regimes that murder millions, capable of love and loyalty and ambition, all mixed together in ways that defy simple judgment. Literally yesterday, on the 25th of November, 2025, a major Russian news website published an article about how interest in Orlova's films has increased dramatically among young Russians, who are discovering them for the first time through online streaming services. This morning, in the news from Moscow, there were reports about a new museum exhibit opening at the Central Cinema Museum that features Orlova's costumes, personal letters, and behind-the-scenes photographs from her films. This week marks exactly 50 years since Orlova's death in January 1975, and cultural institutions across Russia are commemorating this anniversary with special screenings of her films, lectures about her life and career, and debates about her legacy. These are specific facts that you can verify yourself by checking Russian news websites and cultural calendars. What is happening with the topic now is a genuine revival of interest in Soviet cinema of the 1930s and 40s, driven partly by nostalgia among older Russians who remember watching these films with their parents, and partly by curiosity among younger Russians who want to understand what Soviet culture was really like beyond the propaganda and the politics. Streaming services have made Orlova's films available to audiences who would never have seen them otherwise. And surprisingly, many young people find the films charming and entertaining, despite their age and their obvious propaganda elements.
The situation continues in several ways. Film restoration is ongoing, with experts using digital technology to clean up scratches and improve sound quality on prints that have degraded over decades. New research is being published constantly as more archives are opened and more documents become available to historians. Television programs and documentaries about Orlova appear regularly on Russian state television, usually presenting a balanced view that acknowledges both her artistic achievements and her relationship with the Stalin regime. Public interest fluctuates, but has remained consistently high over the past few decades, suggesting that Orlova's place in Russian cultural memory is secure. There are new discoveries happening every year. In 2023, researchers at the State Archive of the Russian Federation found previously unknown letters between Orlova and Stalin himself, revealing that Stalin personally wrote to her several times, praising her performances and offering suggestions for future roles. These letters show the extraordinary degree of Stalin's personal involvement in Soviet cinema and his particular fascination with Orlova. In 2024, audio recordings were discovered of Orlova singing songs that were never released, rehearsal tapes from recording sessions in the 1950s, giving us a fuller picture of her vocal range and technique. More and more people are interested in this subject across multiple demographics. Older Russians remember Orlova from their youth and want to share this memory with younger generations. Middle-aged Russians are rediscovering her films through streaming services and finding them more interesting than they expected. Young Russians interested in fashion and vintage culture are fascinated by Orlova's elaborate costumes and elegant style. Film students are studying her movies as examples of classical Soviet cinema and comparing her performance techniques to modern actors. International film scholars are increasingly including Soviet cinema in their studies of world film history, and Orlova is always mentioned as one of the most important figures. And now everyone wants to know, what will happen next? What are the consequences of this renewed interest in Orlova? Will it lead to a deeper understanding of Soviet history and culture? Will it spark more honest discussions about the relationship between art and politics? Will it inspire new generations of Russian actresses and filmmakers? These are questions that are being debated right now in film schools, cultural institutions, and online forums across Russia and around the world. For Russia, this renewed interest in Orlova and Soviet cinema of the Stalin era has several important effects. The country is being forced to have more nuanced conversations about its Soviet past, moving beyond simple condemnation or simple nostalgia toward a more complex understanding that acknowledges both achievements and crimes. What changed in society is a growing recognition among younger Russians that Soviet culture was not monolithic, that even in the darkest periods of Stalin's terror, ordinary people found ways to experience joy and beauty through film, music, and theater, and that this aspect of Soviet life deserves to be remembered alongside the suffering and repression. Lessons for the future include the importance of preserving cultural heritage even when it is politically complicated, the need to teach media literacy so that people can appreciate art while remaining critical of its propaganda functions, and the understanding that cultural figures from authoritarian eras should be evaluated with both critical thinking and historical empathy, rather than simple hero worship or condemnation. For people living in Russia today, Orlova's story has become a lens through which they examine their own relationship to power and compromise.
How this affects ordinary people is that it prompts conversations about what individuals should do when they live in societies where speaking the truth can be dangerous, where success requires making deals with morally compromised institutions. Changes in society's consciousness include a greater willingness to acknowledge that most people who lived under Stalin were neither heroes nor villains, but ordinary human beings trying to survive, and that judging them harshly from the safety of the present is both easy and unfair. For history itself, the Orlova story has contributed to an ongoing revision of how Soviet culture is understood and taught. How textbooks are being rewritten in Russia and other former Soviet countries reflects a move away from purely ideological interpretations toward more nuanced analysis that considers artistic merit alongside political context. New understanding of the past includes recognition that Stalin-era culture was not simply propaganda imposed from above, but a complex negotiation between state demands, artistic creativity, and popular taste. Links between events that were not seen before are now becoming clear, such as how Orlova's protection of her adopted son Douglas during his arrest reflected a broader pattern of privileged families using their connections to save relatives. For the future of Russian culture and society, Orlova's legacy raises important questions. What this means for our children is that they will inherit a cultural history that is rich but morally complicated, full of masterpieces created under conditions of political oppression. What conclusions need to be drawn include the recognition that art created under dictatorship can still have value and meaning, but that value must always be understood in context. How not to repeat mistakes means learning from the Soviet experience that when the state controls all cultural production, art becomes propaganda, even when it is beautiful and entertaining. Despite everything, we see reasons for hope in how Russians are engaging with this history. The fact that honest conversations are happening about Orlova's compromises, the fact that young people are asking difficult questions rather than simply accepting official narratives, the fact that her films are being preserved and studied rather than forgotten, all of this suggests a growing maturity in how Russian society deals with its Soviet past. But what can we do ourselves with this knowledge about Orlova and the lessons her story teaches? This is not just history to be studied, but wisdom to be applied in our own lives. Preserving memory means making a conscious effort to remember and talk about people like Orlova as complex human beings whose lives reflected difficult times. Remember and pass on stories to your children and grandchildren about what life was really like in the Soviet Union, both the hardships and the moments of joy. Tell grandchildren about the films you watched, the songs you sang, the way culture provided comfort even in the darkest times. Do not let it be forgotten that millions of people lived through the Stalin era, that most of them were ordinary people trying to survive and maintain their humanity. Search for truth by remaining curious about history, by reading books and watching documentaries that present different perspectives on the Soviet past. Be interested in history not as facts to memorize, but as a way to understand human nature. Do not blindly believe the official version of history, whether from Soviet-era propaganda or modern political narratives, but instead seek out multiple sources and think critically. Ask questions when something does not make sense, when the official story seems too neat or too simple, because truth is almost always more complicated than propaganda. How to relate to the past is a personal choice, but it should be based on understanding rather than ignorance, on empathy rather than harsh judgment. Lessons for oneself that can be drawn from Orlova's story include awareness of the compromises we all make in our own lives, recognition that few people face truly heroic choices, but most face daily small choices about integrity and courage. Application in life might mean being more thoughtful about our own career choices, about what we are willing to do for advancement and security, about how we will want to be remembered when our lives are over. Passing on wisdom to the next generation is perhaps the most important thing we can do. What to tell the young is that the world has always been complicated, that moral choices are rarely clear-cut, that understanding why people acted as they did helps us make better choices in the present. What values to pass on include honesty tempered with compassion, critical thinking combined with respect for those who came before, ambition balanced with integrity. Connection of generations happens when older people share their memories and younger people listen with open minds. Each of us is a keeper of memory. Every person who lived through the Soviet era carries within themselves irreplaceable knowledge about what that time was really like. And if we remember, if we talk honestly about the past, if we pass on what we know to those who come after us, the truth will never disappear. Truth has a way of surviving even through decades of repression, emerging eventually when conditions allow, preserved in the memories of ordinary people who witnessed events and refused to forget. We started with what happened on the 26th of January, 1975 year, when Lyubov Orlova died in a Moscow hospital. Just 3 days after desperately calling her husband, Grigory Alexandrov, to her bedside, saying those last words, "How long you were." Now we know the whole story. And it turned out to be a story about a woman who rose from the ruins of her aristocratic family to become the first superstar of Soviet cinema, who made a calculated choice to marry a director who could give her fame, who paid for that fame with childlessness and constant compromise with a murderous regime, and who nevertheless created art that brought genuine joy to millions. What we have learned is that Orlova was neither the perfect Soviet heroine of official propaganda, nor the cynical collaborator of critical accounts, but a complicated human being who made difficult choices under terrible circumstances. We learned about her forced first marriage to save her family, about her traumatic experience when her husband was arrested by the secret police, about her partnership with Aleksandrov that lasted over 40 years, about her adoption of his son, Douglas, about her inability to have biological children, about her heart disease and final illness, about the thousands of people who mourned her death. What remains a mystery are some questions that will never be fully answered. Was her childlessness by choice or by circumstance? How much of her marriage to Aleksandrov was love, and how much was professional partnership? What did she really think about Stalin and the regime she served? But some documents are still classified in Russian archives. Some witnesses who knew her intimately have taken their secrets to the grave. Some aspects of her inner life will remain forever unknowable. There are people who knew her well who do not dare to speak openly, even now, 70 years after Stalin's death, because of family loyalties or political sensitivities. History teaches us that the truth always finds a way. Maybe not immediately, maybe after years or decades, but it comes to light. Orlova's story was hidden and distorted for decades, presented as simple propaganda during her lifetime, debated and argued over after her death, and only now, 50 years later, are we beginning to see the full complexity of who she was and what her life meant. We cannot change the past, but we can remember and learn. These people, Orlova and Aleksandrov, and millions like them who lived through the Stalin era, showed us what the human spirit is capable of, both its capacity for compromise and its resilience, both its hunger for beauty and its willingness to serve power, both its weakness and its strength. That is worth remembering. That inspires us to think more carefully about our own moral choices. And recently, information appeared about another famous Soviet actress from the same era, Valentina Serova, who also had a complicated relationship with Stalin's regime, who also struggled with personal tragedy, who also became a symbol of Soviet culture. About the fact that her story, like Orlova's, reveals truths about what it meant to be a woman, an artist, and a human being in that dark time. But that is already a completely different story. Time will tell. Time always tells.